There's a discussion in photography which is loosely characterized by the two extremes. One is get it right in camera or you're not a proper photographer. The other is it's all about processing. Now, I am somewhere in the middle of this. Processing is very important to me, but camera work is also really important. And I'm going to show you why in this video. Both sides of the argument are correct and both sides of the argument are wrong. Let's get stuck in. So let's talk about the in-camera optimization game. Now this is in effect a series of compromises. The goals of optimizing your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO are not really compatible goals all working towards the same thing. They're competing priorities, and so in order to deal with them you have to have effectively a hierarchy of decision making which will bring you to the right answer. Now let's have a look at how this plays out. So this is fairly basic stuff. We all know this. So ISO is effectively the equivalent of an accelerator pedal in that it will artificially amplify the amount of light that's applied to the photograph. Okay, so this is computer magic that happens in the sensor. It's got nothing to do with actual light. So we often say, with quite a lot of justification, that sticking with the base ISO as far as you can, so 100 on Canon cameras, 50 on Nikon cameras, is the most desirable state of affairs. That will give you your cleanest raw file. Now, shutter speed and aperture have different effects in different circumstances. So let's take shutter speed as the first one. Now we all know what shutter speed will do. It will freeze the motion if you have it fast enough, or it will bring you an acceptable amount of blur given your aesthetic preference if you control it correctly. So if I'm taking a photograph of racehorses, say, I'm going to want some blur in this. So typically what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to take this shot is to pan across, keeping in line with the racehorse. And this is the effect of this is going to blur my background considerably, but that's not really enough. I don't want to have the horse absolutely frozen in aspic. I want a little bit of blur around the hooves and so on. So selecting the appropriate shutter speed in that circumstance is the one that will give me that little bit of blur, and it will take experimentation to find that. Now, the compromise here, of course, is that if I've got my ISO set to base ISO, I've chosen my shutter speed in order to satisfy my aesthetic priority. So the big question now is, have I got enough light to give me a balanced exposure, or is that photograph going to be very dark, or is it going to be overlit? Okay, so depending what's going on there. Now, this then takes me to my use of aperture. There are two things going on with aperture. One is that in any given lens, there is going to be an area where the lens is sharpest. There is going to be an aperture which gives you the optimally sharp photograph for that lens. Now, it's easy to say, right, well, we should always use that aperture, shouldn't we? But then there's another compromise, there's another balancing act to determine, and that is, do you want your background to be sharp or do you want your background to be soft? Now, aperture controls this, so when we're shooting something that is reasonably close to us, we want to establish a separation from the background, and one way of doing that is to throw the background out of focus. And this is controlled by aperture. So if I choose a wide open aperture and I set my focus on the thing that I want to be in focus, then that person object is going to be sharp and the background is going to be out of focus. And this is what we call bokeh. And this is, some goes in and out of fashion. Some people love it, some people don't, but nonetheless, it is a thing. So it's an aesthetic decision as much as it is a practical decision, and the payoff, the balancing act that you have to make here is, do I want to prioritize my aesthetics, or do I want to prioritize making the picture? Okay, so if we go to our decision hierarchy, the first thing, I would suggest that the first thing to do is to prioritize what gives you a good exposure. So go into manual, set your ISO to base ISO, set your aperture to where you want it to be in the first instance, so prioritize your aesthetic, and set your shutter speed to whatever gives you a good exposure according to the camera's light meter. Now, if you look at that and you look at the shutter speed and you find that the shutter speed is too low, what it's telling you is that it needs more light. So when I say too low, I mean if we're working on a manual photograph and it's a landscape, so you've got things that are very far away and you're holding it, then the chances of the photograph being sharp are increasingly small the slower the shutter speed. Okay? So what we want to compensate for that is a higher shutter speed, and in going for a higher shutter speed you're cutting out light, so you've got to find some other way of bringing light into it, and this is when we start to use the ISO in landscape photography in order to boost the amount of light, but not so much that we're introducing other issues into the photograph. Okay, so your decision hierarchy, or my decision hierarchy, goes first of all, get the right exposure, so observe what the camera meter says, and then look at those values and say, do they serve my aesthetic interests properly? And if they do, then that's fine, click. If they don't, then I'm going to need to fiddle around. I'm going to need to, for example, to slow down the shutter speed, letting more light into the picture. I need to mitigate that, balance that by making the aperture narrower. So there's a series of payoffs that you have to make, and the way that I do this is to start off with what the camera tells me is a correct exposure, and then from there I factor in my aesthetic priorities. Now, this actually leads to a whole lot more pain, because we can use neutral density filters to slow down the light, polarizing filters to slow down the light very slightly and to enhance the vibrance of the photograph. We can use intentional camera movements to blur the photograph. There are all sorts of creative things that we can do with the camera that will alter the outcome. But today, I really want to focus on the business of getting the correct exposure, serving your aesthetic priorities, and having a raw file, effectively a digital negative, that is optimized to take into processing. So post-processing can often be something of a reality check, because what you're seeing on the back of the camera is a JPEG. So all of your compromises and all of your creative decisions are still factored down into an image that the camera manufacturer wants to conform to their view of what a good picture should look like. Okay, so what you bring in on the raw file is completely different. So a raw file will look flatter, and it will reveal a great deal more detail that you literally can't see on the back of the camera. So I'm talking about distracting elements around the edge of the frame. I'm talking about noise, darkening off in the corners of the frame, softening towards the edges of the frame. Depending on what lens you've used, all manner of stuff is going to show up that you didn't spot on the back of the camera. So, in my view, post-processing is really about two things. One is corrections, definitely, no question. Every raw file that comes into a camera is in some way compromised, whether that be by faults, issues, characteristics of the lens, or whether it's by the amount of noise that's inherent because you shot it too dark, or whatever it happens to be. There is a certain amount of correction that needs to take place. Now, I use DxO Pure Raw a lot to take the technical imperfections out of my raw files, and on occasion I find myself adding them back in, but that's for aesthetic reasons, and that's a different thing altogether. Okay, so my intention is always to get the raw file to be the most perfect representation technically of what I was pointing the camera at. So any issues that remain are basically my fault, not the camera's fault. So that's when you start to get creative. So first technique, first the technology, then the creativity. Now, we are blessed to be able to lay our hands on the best processing technology the world has ever seen. Now, I'm not talking about AI here. That's a completely separate video. I'm talking about the sheer capability of the processing technology, whether that be DxO Photolab, Adobe Photoshop, half a dozen other applications. It is very, very powerful, and so we can use it for creative endeavors. If I shoot very dark, if I'm actually shooting in the dark, which I was on this particular photograph, I have options in camera to increase that exposure. And the benefit of doing that is I can take that into my processing environment, and I can reduce the amount of light. I can take the highlights out of that picture, or I can alter the exposure. I can massage that picture any way that I want to get back to what I saw. Now, if we look at this photograph, this was photographed very, very dark. And the penalty for that is that if I increase the dark area, there is almost nothing there. It's no detail to be retrieved and a fantastic amount of noise. So in making that decision on the beach, I completely compromised my ability to create, or my ability to explore creative directions with this photograph that may have been open to me. So there are occasions when an optimized raw file will look nothing like the final image that you have in your mind, because what you have done is you have shot this picture with a view to giving yourself options in processing. And that is a completely different thing to getting it right in camera. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, because what you're doing is you're giving yourself options. And why not? Because you have got the best photo processing software that has ever been available. So let's use it creatively, and let's begin by using it to correct the errors and to improve on the technological aspect of the image, and then second step, to use it creatively to deliver the image that you want, to deliver the image that conforms to the vision that you have in your head. The image in the previous section was deliberately underexposed on site, and in a sense that is why it failed. It produced the picture that I wanted it to produce, but the argument I'm making is that my interest would have been better served by exposing it correctly, or even creating multiple exposures, because by exposing it, by adding a couple of stops on, I may well have blown out the highlights. So it may have needed more than one exposure in order to capture that dynamic range that I was after. But what I would have liked to have done was to show some of the detail that are currently hidden in the shadows, perhaps the outline of the boat, and make it so that it would be something other than really, really dark black in that shadowed area, and I think that would make it a much better photograph. So my workflow these days has evolved beyond where we started out, which was take the photograph, get it as right as you can in camera, follow what the camera's meter says, and that will give you a correctly exposed photograph. And then at some later point, taking it into post-processing, and what you're effectively doing in that initial workflow is making the best pictures that you can out of the pictures that you find in your import. Now, what I have moved to now is a sensibility of actually shooting for the edit. So what I'm very much in the business of creating now is raw files that are optimized to give me maximum flexibility in the edit. And sometimes that means that the photograph that I take bears only a passing resemblance to the photograph that I end up with. But the important thing is to have that continuity, to be able to look at a scene. The real skill here is look at a scene and visualize it, and in other words, to see the end point, and then to have your seamless workflow that takes you all the way through to that end point. So you're building your camera work and your post-processing work into one continuous workflow. And I think that's where I am at the moment, and I think producing the best photography that I've ever produced. I find it immensely satisfying, and developing that sense of visualization and experiment with the camera. Why not? Take some that are overexposed, take some that are underexposed, but use it as a means of showing yourself what's possible, of showing yourself what this picture might look like if it was slightly underexposed, and equivalently what it would look like if it was overexposed. Now, be aware of the limitations of software. You cannot retrieve detail from white. That's an absolute non-starter. You can retrieve more detail from the darks, but use the knowledge of the technical limitations of what you have in your hand and what you have in your computer to make the best pictures that you possibly can. And I think what's key in this is vision. I think if you can develop that vision that shows you what the photograph should look like in the end as a print, then your responsibility then is to come back with the raw image that will give you the most chance of recreating that photograph in post. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, this is a methodology that I teach to all my students that come on the workshops that I run in the Alpujarras. We've got one kicking off next year. Have a look at the 8peaks.photography website if you're interested in that. And if you found this video interesting or even useful, give us a tick down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're interested, and we'll see you back here next week with another video. Thanks very much, guys, for watching, and see you later. Bye.